Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Tristan Grunow, a visiting assistant professor at Pacific University, host of the Meiji at 150 podcast, and host of the Japan on the Record podcast, to talk about the transforming urban landscape of Japan during the Meiji Restoration. All right, Dr. Grunow, thank you for joining me on the What is Asia podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So you're a specialist in the Meiji period in Japan, and this period is named after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Can you start by describing to people, for those who don't know, what is the Meiji Restoration and why is the year 1868 so important? And I know in your podcast, which I've listened to, you sort of try to problematize this year. So maybe you can also introduce why maybe we shouldn't think of 1868 as so important.
It's a great question, and definitely one that's very central to all of the research that we do as modern historians of Japan, because 1868 really is the date that is often used as this starting point of modern Japan. We might often say it's the start of Japan's modernizing moment. And so, as you were saying, the Meiji period, which goes from 1868 to 1912, is named after the Restoration, but is in fact actually named after the Meiji Emperor. And the reason that it's called the Meiji Restoration is in 1868, in fact, on January 3rd, 1868, according to the Gregorian calendar, it's on that day that the Meiji Emperor is restored to power. At least that's the kind of the pretense that we're given during the Restoration itself. In fact, it's a small political coup d'etat that happens within the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. A number of leaders from these four powerful clans, Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen, those, I mean, there's the most powerful clans of the Tokugawa period. They conspire to actually take the emperor, who was already reigning as the emperor, but then actually restore him into this position where he's both reigning and ruling. And so that's why they call it the Meiji Restoration. But in fact, it's actually a very small event that really, is kind of taking place above the clouds, above the, out of the concern of the everyday lives of most people in Japan. But from this small event, we get revolutionary transformations in Japan. And so the Restoration, we might say, ripples out throughout the Meiji period, all the way until 1912. And these dates are actually based on the life of the Meiji Emperor himself, 1868 being when he starts his reign, 1912 when he dies. I mean, we could even get a little bit more, a little bit cuter with our terminology and say, it's also a point that even history changes in Japan, because quite literally the way that Japan measures time changes in 1868. Not only in terms of clock time, which is introduced later, the Gregorian calendar is introduced later, Greenwich Mean Time is introduced in the Meiji period, but even the way of thinking about years, because prior to 1868, whenever there was an inauspicious event, like a natural disaster, they would actually change the reign name. But after 1868, reign name, or the way that years were counted, were tied specifically to the rule of the emperor. So we could even think about how even the understanding of history itself is changing in 1868. And that's really just one example of how revolutionary all of these transformations were during the Meiji period. We think of it as Japan's modernizing moment because it's after 1868 is, as I mentioned, Japan really tries to align itself with the universal understandings of the world, going around looking at what the other countries around the world are doing and importing all sorts of policies, technologies, institutions, political systems, importing all of these things into Japan to remake Japan into what looks like to the Western countries a more Western style country. And so this is the first time that Japan, as I mentioned, gets the Gregorian calendar, clock time, Greenwich Mean Time. even things, we would say the outward markers, the outward manifestations of modernity, things like locomotives and telegraphs and lighthouses, Western style architecture, even things, like I've been doing my own research on, even, up to date macadam style pavement and asphalt pavement, and, really trying to remake Japan in every way possible into a more Western style, or what they would think of as modern country. There's one Japanese leader at the time, a man named Inoue Koru, who's a very influential politician at the time, says that very consciously we have to remake Japan into a European-style empire in East Asia. And he's talking about every aspect of life, whether it's the way people are thinking, the clothes people are wearing, wearing top hats and tuxedos, cutting off the samurai chonmage hairstyle, taking off the robes, and even bringing in constitution, constitutional monarchy, a diet, as the parliament is called. And so this is the moment that Japan really does self-consciously cast off Asia and don the robes of Western modernity. And there's no better example of it than these juxtaposing images that I really like to use of the Meiji Emperor himself, where we can think of it prior to the Restoration. We see him donned in his Shinto-style robes, where the emperor is the high priest of Shinto, so in his traditional garb of wearing his Shinto priestly robes. And then just several years later, suddenly he's bedecked in this kind of Prussian-styled, German-styled military uniform. He's taking his place amongst all of the modern rulers of the world. And this is really an embodiment of how Japan was starting to see itself because of all the transformations during the Meiji period. So it's a completely far-reaching transformation that we get after 1868. And the year itself, as you mentioned, is something that, we as historians, we tend to fetishize dates a little bit too much, perhaps. And certainly all of these changes don't happen overnight. It's not like everybody goes to bed December 31st, 1867, looking like a samurai, wakes up the next morning, with a tuxedo on.
Yeah.
I mean, some of these changes take decades, but all of them are all done in the so-called spirit of 1868. So even if, again, that kind of initial coup d'etat itself was really something that just happened within the walls of the palace, the impacts of it reverberated throughout Japanese society.
So part of what you get into leads us into what is your research, which is something that might seem a little mundane on the surface, just looking at roads and pavement, but it's something that, as you demonstrate, is very telling about the way the Japanese government wanted to see themselves. So, for example, you wrote one article called Pebbles of Progress, and how the Japanese government wanted to redo all of the streets in Tokyo. What did that mean? What significance did doing something as mundane as redoing the streets mean for the government at that time?
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that article, and for really highlighting, it's this kind of the taken for granted aspect of mundane things of that surround us, even things like street pavements or things that we really take for granted on an everyday level. I think are what makes them all the more important. The less we notice things, that just shows how ingrained they are in our own life. And street pavements and the materials of the built environment that surrounds us is really one of those things that we take for granted. And that's why I think it's all the more important to pay attention to how those things are changing during the Meiji period. I mean, we could talk about why is the government so intent on catching up to the West? I mean, it's important to point out that, as much as we fetishize this date 1868, many of these transformations are actually starting, in some cases, in the 1850s. Very famously, the Americans in the person of Commodore Matthew Perry shows up on the shores of Japan in 1853, basically demanding that Japan open its doors to the West. This very early case of gunboat diplomacy that really alarms people in Japan. Says, well, if we, look how far behind we've fallen. We haven't been keeping up with all of the technological advancements that are happening outside of Japan. Look, they're forcing all of these unequal treaties on us where we're not even allowed to set our own tariffs. We're not even allowed to hold Western criminals account within our own shores. You know, we have to do something to catch up in the eyes of the West. And so for many leaders of the Meiji government, that meant visibly presenting to the foreigners that we're just like you are. And so that's why it really did, in some cases, mean superficial things like putting on a top hat, putting on, you know, a Western style beard and mustache, or even a tuxedo, to really just present, look, we're no different than you are. And so all of these transformations that I was mentioning, things like adopting a constitution, things like starting a parliament, all of these things were designed to really prove to the West that Japan was just as modern as these other Western countries. And so you have all of these Westerners who are coming into Japan, whether they're traders, diplomats, what have you. You know, what they see in Japan is this old backwards Oriental style country that, you know, is nowhere near as up to date, or nowhere near as modern as we are. So we can't treat them as an equal. And so the government says, well, if we have to prove that we're an equal to them, we might as well show that we're just as up to date as they are. And that's whether it's in terms of the government or even in terms of the city itself. And so one very early attempt at this starts in 1872 with a redevelopment project right in the center of Tokyo called the Ginza Bricktown that I've written about. And really what this is, it's trying to recreate in the heart of Tokyo a small piece of the outside world. And so a fire ravages downtown Tokyo, clears out about 5,000 hectares of land. And so in that place, the government hires a foreign architect to come in and build foreign buildings made out of brick. So they're called the Brick Town. So it becomes known as the Brick Town. And the point here is just so that, you know, any of those foreign tourists or diplomats, once they get off the train at Shimbashi Station, they're walking through Ginza Bricktown, you know, they'll look around and say, oh, wow, this looks just like, you know, London or Paris or whatever. And that's exactly what the Meiji government wanted, because if the Westerners could see that Tokyo was modernizing, even in this kind of visceral, material sense, then they would think, well, maybe we can deal with them as an equal. And it means revising these unequal treaties that have been imposed upon the Meiji government. And so street improvements, I think, were really key to this, because especially for these Meiji leaders, they're thinking about, well, if we have to present a modern appearance of the city to these foreign advisors and foreign visitors, the best place we can start is in the streets. Get rid of the old dirt roads, replace them in macadam, which was the most up-to-date pavement style at the time. And it will make the city much more presentable and more welcoming to these foreigners. We'll get rid of, they use this term futeisai, which really means the disheveled appearance or uncleanliness of the city. We'll get rid of that bad appearance and really impress the foreigners. And so many of these urban reforms in the early 1870s were really targeting foreign visitors. And so it's really instructive to look at accounts of foreign visitors themselves, because it's actually quite funny, you know, when you have all these tour guides that are being written about Japan. I mean, Japan was a huge object of curiosity in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s after it was open to the West. So all these foreign travelers like Isabella Bird, who a famous traveler who went all around East Asia, but all sorts of tour guides that are written, you know, introducing Japan to a curious American audience. But they're all talking about, you know, how unimpressive the Japanese capital is. You know, there's no tall buildings, there's no magnificent streets, there's no big palaces that you would expect to see in the Western countries. But they do, like, well, there is that one pretty nice looking street with some nice brick buildings there. But what's funny is the foreign visitors absolutely hate Ginza Bricktown. They say, well, look at how ugly those brick buildings are. And one of my favorite quotes is from one woman traveler who says, oh, what a shame that, you know, when Japan opened to the West and they started copying our architecture, you know, architecture in London was the most disgusting, ugly architecture ever. And so now it's being transplanted into Japan. what, those foreign the Western tourists who went to Japan, they wanted to see, Oriental exotic architecture. They did not want to see the kind of brick bungalows that you would expect to see in suburban London.
Well, the last part of your answer there leads into the next question I wanted to get into. But before we do that, I want to go on a tangent just for a minute. Do you know what started the Ginza fire in 1872?
So, unfortunately, there's no big famous story like Bess the cow in Chicago that started the Chicago fire. But what we do know is it started in what's called the Watakuta Gate of the Imperial Palace. It was one of the soldiers' barracks lining the outside of the Imperial Palace. And so it starts there. And then it happened at the end, according to the old Japanese lunar calendar, it was the 26th day of the second month of 1872. By the Western calendar, I think it was about April 4th or so. And so, but this is very characteristic of fires in the city of Edo, or Tokyo, as it becomes known after 1868. Especially during the winter months, you get really strong winds that come in from the north and kind of sweep to the southeast. And so you just get this one little fire that starts in the Imperial Palace, and then because of the strong winds, just gets swept out towards Tokyo Bay to the southeast. And so it clears out all of this land. But part of that is because the method of fire control in Edo, or in early Tokyo at the time, was not to put out a fire. Fires were an incredibly common occurrence in Tokyo. Even in 1872, there had already been several hundred fires, several hundred houses built. Prior to 1872, from 1868, there's hundreds of fires a year. And then you go all the way back into the history of Edo, starting in the 15th century, where fires become so common that there's this very popular saying that fires and fistfights are like the flowers of Edo. It's just how frequently they occur. And it makes sense. Edo, by 1800, by 1700, is probably the largest city in the world, about 1 million people who are all living in a country that is incredibly earthquake prone. And so rather than having massive brick architecture or stone architecture, you have a lot of people who are building in wood. Wood shakes in earthquakes, so in fact, it's much more earthquake proof. And so you have a large number of people living in a cramped space, all of whom are living in wood houses. And so you can imagine fires becoming very prevalent. Throw in all of these strong winds during the winter, and it's no surprise that the winters are especially prone to fire. And so they happen so frequently that the method of fire control is not to try to put out a fire. In fact, what you do is you try to guide the fire as quickly to the water as possible. And so you would have fire companies. In fact, there's multiple competing fire companies in Edo. It's not provided by the government. They're actually private companies that wealthy landowners would hire to come protect their houses and everything. But what they would do is, rather than fight the fire, they were not armed with water cannons or anything like that. They were armed with axes and these big long sticks with hooks on them. Because what they would do is wherever the fire started in that house, they would just go tear down the houses next to it to make sure that the other houses weren't burnt down. And so then you could kind of create a fire path, a path for the fire to follow as quickly to the ocean as possible. And so it would put itself out. So as massive as this 1872 Ginza fire is, what's remarkable, burns, displaces some, thousands of people, burns hundreds of buildings, all this, only kills 7 people. In fact, 7 people, I think 1 or 2 of them may have been fighters themselves. But it just really highlights how practiced people had become at evading these fires, grabbing up whatever they could carry. Whatever they couldn't carry, they would put into underground fireproof, cellars, seal up the windows of their buildings with mud to make sure there no embers got in, and then just flee with what they could carry. And so really speaks to how common these fires were. But unfortunately, we don't know what actually happened. Maybe it was a cow, I don't know, just like
Yeah. So this Ginza fire happens in 1872, rips through a major part of Tokyo. And I want to now jump into less so what was actually happening on the ground, but I want to jump into the imagination of the government. In one of your articles, you talk about how a number of pieces of artwork were produced
Mm.
depicting these vibrant streets and all these Japanese citizens living modern lives surrounded by not only modern streets but modern houses and architecture. um, who was producing these paintings? And I also think that you mentioned in that one article there was some literature too that was
Mm.
produced. Who was producing these works of art, and who was it made for? Was it made for the Japanese? Was it made to convince the Westerners, hey, look at how modern we were? Was it both?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and uh, I mean, there was a very strong uh, plebeian art tradition in Japan, especially after the 1700s or so, and so many of these woodblock prints that are depicting places like the Ginza brick town, other famous places around Tokyo in the early 1870s are really just kind of falling right into this tradition of woodblock prints of famous places around Japan that become very popular during the Tokugawa period. And so around the year 1700, the same time that Tokyo is becoming, or Edo as it was called at the time, is becoming probably the largest city in the world, it's probably one of the most vibrant cities as well in terms of plebeian culture. And so this is a time that's known as the Genroku period, right around the turn of the 17th century. Um, yeah, sorry, right around the turn of the 18th century going into the early 1700s. And so we have all sorts of plebeian cultural pursuits. You may have heard of kabuki theater, for example, becomes very popular at the time. Puppet theater as well, bunraku puppet theater. Kyogen, a type of comedic performance, a stage performance. And then as part of that, you get even popular culture like short stories becoming very popular. Um, I've ever heard of Matsuo Basho, Mr. Banana Tree, as my niece calls him, going around, traveling around Tokyo or traveling around Japan. Even poets who are writing all sorts of linked verse and all sorts of comedic poetry. It's just part of this very vibrant culture of Edo. And woodblock prints were certainly one of the most popular forms of popular art. And so there's many famous woodblock artists, Kuniyoshi, Hiroshige. If you've ever seen that, the print of the giant tsunami wave enveloping Mount Fuji, that's a Hiroshige print, for example. And so those very famous artists actually start schools, and people following in their lineage. And so by the time we get to the 1870s, the prints in particular that you're talking about, I think one of them was by Hiroshige III or Kuniyoshi II. Uh, and so they're following in this tradition of highlighting so-called famous places. This is something that you would see examples of famous places all over Japan during the Tokugawa period. But now, so they're in the same tradition, but now what they're depicting is a little bit different. And so after 1872, and this Ginza Bricktown becomes is built, it really becomes this kind of beacon of civilization and enlightenment during the Meiji period. And this is a catch-all term for all things new and Western and modern, and all of the, it's this buzzword kind of that really speaks to all of this attempt to catch up to the West in order to surpass the West and bring in all these Western things. And so these prints that we get of the Bricktown really try to force all these things in there. And so some of these prints, it's they're just almost overflowing with bustling activity. There's horse-drawn carriages, there's horse-drawn trolley cars, street lights, gas lamps, even electric lights in some cases. Of course, these huge brick buildings that become, or that give the name Bricktown. And then the people as well. And so you'll see people wearing bowler hats, Western style hats, maybe some Western style dress. And what is really striking to me is that, as you mentioned, these are probably imaginations. These are probably not very realistic in terms of representing what the streets look like in actuality. And so that raises the question of, well, why then are they embellishing the vibrancy of Ginza Bricktown? And I think it's really telling when you look at some of the titles. And so it's, titles of really emphasizing, all classes, high and low, coming together and participating in this prosperity of the new brick town. And I think it's important to note that they're using terms like all classes, high and low, because one of the earliest pronouncements of this Meiji government in 1868 is what's come to be known as the Five Charter Oath. And it's kind of, what we think of as the revolutionary statement of this new Meiji government. And, it's earliest pronouncement or even earliest kind of guiding principles released by this new government. And it's, saying things like, we're going to tear asunder all of the evil customs of the past. And we're going to search out, information from around the world. And all things will now be just, or will be based on the just laws of nature. And of course, they're kind of referring to, well, we have to get rid of all those old things that we were doing under the Tokugawa regime. All of those things like sumptuary restrictions or things that prevented people from changing jobs, or laws that said if you're this kind of class of person, you're only allowed to wear this style of clothing, or things that prevented any sort of open deliberation. And so in fact, the first 3 articles are all about, well, we're going to settle all matters through open deliberation. And, people won't be living in an ascriptive social hierarchy anymore. If you're, you can pursue any job you want regardless of what class you are. And then one of them specifically says all classes, high and low, will come together to make decisions and advance the prosperity of the state. And so now here we have, in this kind of print form, this illustration of all classes of Edo who are coming in and really kind of not only observing this new Western style city or Western style space in the heart of Tokyo, but really also participating in it, because they're not just flaneurs, they're not just people who are going out for a walk, they're not just, sightseers gawking at the buildings. They're people who are, it's people who are actually driving the carriages, people are driving the horse-drawn trolleys, people pulling rickshaws, which was an invention of the late 1860s, traders or even merchants from China who are coming in. Not only are they observing it, they're contributing to this new prosperity, because everybody now has the ability to make themselves rich, and everybody now is contributing to this modernization of Japan.
So we just discussed the imagination of the government in Japan, but you note at the end of your article that the Ginza Bricktown did not live up to the expectations that the government had. So my question would be why, and what were the feelings of the residents who lived in this area, whose homes and shops and everything that they held to be familiar were destroyed?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question too. And you had asked also about, why, these imaginations, why did the artist depict them that way? Just to sell things. People were curious, they wanted to hear it. That was a style of news, basically. But the people who lived there, the residents, hated it just as much as the foreigners did. One of the most striking things I think about when I was doing this research was reading all of these Japanese government documents and really kind of reading between the lines of the documents to really uncover how much people hated this. Because all of these documents were always about, like, hey, we've been hearing a lot of complaints about this project. If you guys don't stop complaining, we're going to fine you. Or we keep getting reports of people disrupting the construction. Please stop. They keep reporting these things. And so obviously people are reacting to this in ways that are contrary to the government's wishes. And I think it's not hard to understand why. I mean, the fire itself displaced thousands of people. They have nowhere else to go. And so they're going to go back and rebuild as quickly as possible. But the government, though, had banned any sort of reconstruction. They're saying, well, in order to make this district possible, we're going to ban all reconstruction, and then we're going to build brick houses for you. And so in the meantime, what are the people going to do? Because it's taking months in order for these houses to be built. And so what happens in the meantime is all of these residents are building makeshift dwellings. And the government has to repeatedly ask and then increasingly threaten people to tear down and relocate. And so we can get a sense that the people aren't very happy, first of all, being displaced from their own homes. There's people who start spreading rumors about how low quality these new houses are. The government has to put out a warning that anyone who spreads rumors ridiculing the project or falsely criticizing the construction quality will be met with so-called strict punishment. And so obviously people must have been saying bad things about this. And then once the buildings are built themselves, nobody moves in. And so, well, why were they so unpopular? And there's a very famous book called Low City, High City by Edward Seidensticker, where he talks about how these just buildings were just incredibly unfamiliar to Japan, to people in Japan. And as a result, were just incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, as I mentioned before, most Japanese houses at the time were built out of wood, which was very good for earthquake readiness, but also meant that during the summer you could move walls around, and perhaps you've seen Japanese architecture with the papered sliding walls and sliding doors. You can't do that with a brick house. And so you imagine this brick house that during the hot and humid summers almost becomes like an oven inside, and then during the winters brick doesn't really hold heat very well, so then it becomes almost like an icebox inside. And then it gets all moldy inside, and so they're just an incredibly uncomfortable place for Japanese people to live. And so the residents of Ginza, whether it was because they were upset about the kind of heavy-handed imposition of this project onto their own neighborhood by the government, whether it was because they found the buildings uncomfortable, whether it was because they just disagreed with the Meiji government in general, they just voted with their feet and refused to move in altogether. And so the project, in fact, even though it's announced in 1872, the government invests a lot of money. In fact, a sizable portion of the national budget actually gets spent specifically on Ginza Bricktown. They have to they basically have to withdraw from the project basically a year later. And in fact, we think of it as Ginza Bricktown today because it was pretty much limited to the neighborhood of Ginza. And, the fire was in Ginza, most of the reconstruction was in Ginza. And so as a result, most of the brick buildings erected in the wake of the Ginza fire are localized to the neighborhood of Ginza. But in fact, the government was meant for this to be a slow and steady transformation of the entire city of Tokyo. And if you read all of the pronouncements, they all talk about, well, this is just the beginning. Ginza is the start of this process where all of the houses around Tokyo will be rebuilt in brick. They said for the purpose of fireproofing, but also certainly to show to the West how modern Tokyo had become. But they have to basically cancel any sort of plans to have Ginza, the Bricktown, grow from beyond Ginza, specifically because of this resistance of the local people. And in fact, when they announced the government's withdrawal from the project, the finance minister at the time, an incredibly influential politician named Okuma Shigenobu, even says, well, we're canceling this because brick houses are unsuited to the backwards ways of Tokyo residents.
Well, I just had two more questions before we wrap up here. One of which is, and this is going to show my ignorance in the understanding of Tokyo's urban landscape, is the Ginza Bricktown still there? And if so, what legacy has it left behind for people today?
That's a fantastic question too, and one that's actually really complex because, well, first, Ginza Bricktown is no longer there. No, by the 1880s and 1890s, the houses that were built, there was several thousand houses that were built. A lot of them had been kind of retrofitted into things that were more aligned to what, a traditional idea of a Japanese domicile. So maybe some of the brick walls, windows had been busted into them. And so had been converted into more traditional Japanese storefronts. And then from around the same time, they, rather than stores or things like this, they actually become home to many newspapers. And so there was a very vibrant newspaper industry in Japan in the 1880s and 1890s. And many of them are fomenting what becomes known as the popular rights movement. And so you have these very liberal press, very liberal newspapers that are very critical of the government. And so they're all housed in Ginza. Whatever is left of Ginza Bricktown is actually destroyed in 1923 by the Great Kanto earthquake. But if we go to Ginza today, in fact, what the name Ginza is most redolent for most tourists today as being the really high-end shopping district in Tokyo. It's where all of the big fancy name brand stores are. It's certainly one of the biggest tourist attractions for fancy, shopping and all of those name brands that I only recognize just because I know they're in Ginza. Louis Vuitton and Prada and all these things. They're all there in Ginza. And so it's easy to perhaps too haphazardly draw a straight line between Ginza Bricktown and the Ginza that we know today as this fancy shopping district. But there is a lot of reasons to be a little bit more skeptical of that. And there's been a lot of work done, in fact, in Japanese urban history, even going so far as looking at, well, did Bricktown raise the real estate values of the Ginza area? But really, Ginza doesn't become too much of a popular destination for residents of Tokyo until the 1920s or 30s. In fact, it's, like I mentioned before, it's mainly newspapers. It's not really this kind of bustling commercial district as much as neighboring Nihonbashi is, or Asakusa throughout the teens and 20s is certainly much more the center of pop culture and urban culture in Tokyo until the later 20s, when a subway opens. And in fact, the very first subway line in Tokyo goes from Asakusa to Ginza and then over to Shibuya. And so it's that starts bringing people into Ginza. And it's really from the 1920s that Ginza blossoms into this really high-end shopping district that we know of it today.
And the last question I wanted to ask here is, I ask this of every person that I have on, what are a couple of books that you would recommend to people who maybe have listened to this and want to learn a little bit more?
About the history of Tokyo, absolutely. There's, as I mentioned, there's a fantastic book by Edward Seidensticker. It's split into 2 volumes. One's called Low City, High City. The second one's called Tokyo Rising. I believe now they're both available in a combined volume, although I don't recall the name of that volume. And what his book does really well is, it's not it's not one of those dry histories of urban planning where it's like, well, there was this plan, then this plan, and this plan. What he does is, because Seidensticker himself was a scholar of Japanese literature, he basically almost leads somewhat of a tour through the history of Tokyo by telling stories from literature and a lot of personal vignettes from his years of living in Tokyo. And so it's almost like, walking through the streets of Tokyo with someone who's lived there for decades, kind of whispering in your ear, like, oh, this part of the city, this is where this happened, and this famous writer said this kind of thing about it. Like, oh, look at this bar, that's where this very famous writer used to drink whiskey and write. And so it's a really cool insider's look at Tokyo, and that's certainly one that I would recommend. And then there's, from more historical view of the actual urban planning history of Tokyo, Andre Sorensen has a book called The Making of Urban Japan, which is a very detailed, very meticulous look at all of the historical development of Tokyo in particular. going through things like Ginza Bricktown, but also importantly going through what happens after the 1923 earthquake, and then what happens after World War II and the firebombing of Tokyo and the reconstruction of Tokyo. And then I think another one that gives a really insightful look at the neighborhoods of Tokyo and the kind of different cultures that have emerged from Tokyo, and even things, like historical memory and urban memory associated with certain sites, is a book by an urban historian named Jordan Sand called Tokyo Vernacular. It's a little shorter book, but really, really weighty in terms of introducing some very intriguing concepts about how the history of Tokyo is remembered and mobilized for political purposes, and even in going into things like the museums of Tokyo. Why are certain things like the Ginza Bricktown celebrated so much while others are forgotten, for example? And so it really brings the politics into urban life in a way that makes for really instructive reading.
Great. Well, Dr. Grunow, thank you for coming onto the podcast and having this talk.
Thank you so much. It's always fun talking about Tokyo and the Meiji period.
And again, if you want to learn more about Meiji, you can go watch, or listen to rather, Meiji at 150 and Japan on the Record. I believe it's available anywhere where you get your podcast, correct?
Anywhere you get your podcast, yes.
All right, great. And you can go to nakotadefonso.com or check out more videos on this YouTube channel if you want to see more content of the What is Asia podcast. And we will see you next time. Okay.